On March 8, 1960, a 12-year-old boy was led into a sterile operating room in a small Nevada town, and within minutes an ice pick-like instrument was thrust through his eye socket, forever changing the course of his life. Howard Dully, a shy, lanky child from a broken home, was about to become the youngest known survivor of a transorbital lobotomy, a procedure that would soon become the most infamous symbol of psychiatric excess in American medicine. Howard's early years were marked by instability. Born in 1948 to a mother who struggled with mental illness and a father who was largely absent, he spent much of his childhood shuffling between relatives, foster homes, and the custody of a stepmother, Lois, who claimed she could fix his behavior with a quick fix. By the time Howard was 12, his stepmother described him as unmanageable, defiant, and dangerously impulsive. In an era when the American psychiatric establishment still clung to invasive brain surgery as a cure for behavioral disorders, Lois found herself presented with a solution that sounded both radical and, to her, remarkably simple. Enter Dr. Walter Freeman, the charismatic, controversial neurosurgeon who had popularized the transorbital lobotomy in the 1940s. Freeman's technique, derived from Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz's original prefrontal lobotomy, involved inserting a leucotome, a slender, spatula-shaped instrument, through the orbital socket, then sweeping it back and forth to sever connections in the prefrontal cortex. The procedure could be performed in a doctor's office, required no anesthesia beyond a brief dose of electroconvulsive shock, and most importantly for Freeman, could be billed as a quick, inexpensive fix for a range of mental illnesses. When Freeman arrived in Reno, Nevada in early 1960, he brought with him a portable set of tools, a briefcase of pamphlets touting the miracle of the lobotomy, and a reputation that had already saved countless lives, or so his supporters claimed. He met Howard's stepmother in a cramped waiting room, presented his case, and offered a consent form that promised a lasting cure for the boy's behavioral problems. Lois, desperate and misled by the promise of normalcy, signed without fully understanding the irreversible consequences. The operation itself lasted less than 10 minutes. After a brief pre-operative shock to render Howard semi-conscious, Freeman lifted the instrument, known as the orbitoclast, and drove it through the thin bone above the eye socket. He then rotated the instrument, sweeping it back and forth to sever the white matter of the frontal lobes. In his notes, Freeman described the procedure as a triumph of modern neurosurgery, noting only a minor hemorrhage and no immediate complications. Howard was left with a bandaged forehead, a lingering headache, and an unsettling emptiness that would only become clear in the years to come. The legal and ethical dimensions of Howard's lobotomy were murky at best. In the early 1960s, the United States lacked robust regulations governing psychosurgery, and parental consent was often deemed sufficient for minors. Nonetheless, the case attracted attention when a local newspaper published a story about the youngest lobotomy patient in the nation, prompting a flurry of letters to the state health department. Dr. Freeman, already under scrutiny for his unorthodox methods, faced renewed calls for oversight. In 1961, the Nevada State Board of Health held a hearing to investigate the propriety of performing transorbital lobotomies on minors without a thorough psychiatric evaluation. Although the board ultimately concluded that the procedure was within the bounds of contemporary medical practice, it recommended stricter documentation and a mandatory waiting period for patients under 18. Howard's post-operative life was a stark testament to the procedure's brutality. He emerged from the operating room with a dulled affect, diminished speech, and a profound lack of initiative. School attendance plummeted, and his once curious mind became a shadow of itself. Within months, he was institutionalized at a state mental hospital, where he spent 3 years in a ward filled with other lobotomized patients, many of whom exhibited the same apathetic demeanor that had been touted as success. It was only after a compassionate nurse recognized his lingering intelligence that Howard was transferred to a more supportive environment, where he learned to read and eventually graduated from high school. The eventual autopsy of the lobotomy, both literal and figurative, came decades later. In the 1990, advances in neuroimaging allowed researchers to scan the brains of former lobotomy patients, revealing extensive damage to the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive functions, impulse control, and personality. When Howard Dully agreed to undergo magnetic resonance imaging in 1998, the scans displayed a pronounced reduction in frontal lobe volume, confirming what Freeman's contemporaries had whispered about in hushed tones. These images, later featured in the documentary The Lobotomist, provided visual proof of the irreversible destruction that had been dismissed as a mere surgical side effect. Howard's personal aftermath unfolded in a remarkable manner. In his early 30s, he discovered a talent for woodworking and later for writing, channeling his experiences into a memoir titled My Lobotomy, 2005. The book offered a harrowing, first-person account of the procedure's impact on his cognition, relationships, and sense of self. It also ignited a broader conversation about the ethics of involuntary psychiatric interventions, prompting medical schools to incorporate the history of lobotomy into their curricula as a cautionary tale of hubris. The legacy of the procedure, however, extended beyond Howard's individual story. Dr. Walter Freeman's career unraveled after a series of high-profile lawsuits, and the public outcry sparked by the death of a patient in 1967. Subscribe to the Autopsy Files for more stories like this.